The following is a special presentation of KTVA 11 News. Legalizing marijuana, increasing the minimum wage, Anchorage and its unions squaring off over how to work together, to mine or not to mine near Bristol Bay. 4 issues that could change the fortunes of Alaska. 4 issues that have divided us. 4 issues that will unite us as we go to the polls November 4th. Tonight, hear from the stakeholders who believe with great passion that they know issues best. How can you prosper in the ever-changing landscape of living life in the 49th state? Show me the money, Alaska's fiscal future. We take you now to the studios of KTVA 11 News.
Good evening and welcome to a special presentation of KTVA 11 News. Show me the money, Alaska's fiscal future. I'm Emily Carlson. Now, it's one of the most controversial issues on the ballot this November. Ballot Measure to enact to tax and regulate the production, sale, and use of marijuana. Tonight, we're joined by a number of people to discuss the measure and what its passage could mean for the financial future of our state and the general health and welfare of Alaskans. Now, before we chat, let's get everyone up to speed. The idea of legal marijuana in our state has lit a fire underneath Alaskans from all walks of life.
I just completely disagree with any of these scare tactics that have been going on.
At hearings across the state, public testimony was interrupted with catcalls,
Let's be respectful.
heckling, and profanity.
Excuse me, you've already had your opportunity to talk. It's my turn.
Most of the interruptions at this September 23rd debate came from supporters of Ballot 2. Their main argument is that alcohol is more dangerous than weed.
Alcohol is a much more dangerous drug than marijuana because it is highly addictive, whereas marijuana is not.
But medical professionals on the other side of the issue say that's simply not true.
The pro-pot people will tell you it's not addicting. That is a lie. 9% of users overall become addicted, even if they use a little bit of it. 17% of those who begin use in adolescence become addicted.
Dr. George Stewart was a lung specialist for more than 30 years here in Alaska. He says pot is more dangerous than and contains more chemicals than cigarettes.
It is toxic, no question about it. They want you to believe, the pro-pot people want you to believe it's not toxic, it's not addicting. That is a lie.
What worries pot opponents the most are pot edibles, and more specifically, edibles like cookies, chips, and candy, food that is especially attractive to young people.
The fact that you can have a ring pot instead of a ring pop speaks to the fact that this is geared towards a much younger audience, and when you bring in new users, then you have a lifelong customer.
These candy things, put them away in a cupboard where they can't reach it. You know, keep it away from your kids. Instruct them not to. I keep alcohol in my house. I don't see my 6-year-old trying to go get to it.
Disabled vet George Hedges says he smokes marijuana to deal with the post-traumatic stress disorder he got serving overseas. He'd be one of the thousands of Alaskans that vote yes, folks say, will boost state coffers.
Tax revenues are real. The state of Colorado sees continually increasing month by month revenues.
But vote no Alaskans say the tax revenue raised in our state wouldn't be enough to cover the extra costs thrown on local police to enforce the new laws.
I have seen people that are too intoxicated by ingestion of drugs to be operating a vehicle. I think anybody here who smokes has seen some of their buddies that have had too much.
To smoke or not to smoke, we hash out marijuana so that you have all the information you need to make an informed decision at the ballot box. All right, now let's introduce our first panel. We flipped a coin, and so we will start on this side of the table with those who want to prevent the legalization of marijuana here in Alaska. First up, we have Christina Woolston with Big Marijuana, Big Mistake, Vote No on 2. She is a mother and the executive with Shaniga Corporation. She's also a lifelong Alaskan, and she grew up in Bristol Bay. With her is John Wanamaker. He's also with the Vote No on 2 campaign. Mr. Wanamaker is the father of 3 and started several businesses here in Alaska. He now works to help fund other people that are looking to do the same. Let's head over to the other side of the table. These people want to legalize the use of recreational pot. Joining us now is Dr. Kelly Drew. Kelly is a medical researcher with the University of Alaska Fairbanks and co-chair of the effort to legalize pot. And next to her is Dr. Tim Hinterberger. He also holds a PhD and is a medical educator with the University of Alaska Anchorage. He too is part of the Yes on 2 campaign. Now, folks at home, we want to tell you this isn't a formal debate. It's a free-flowing conversation between stakeholders. We asked each person to limit their responses to a couple of minutes each so everyone can get their say. To get us started, both sides will get 60 seconds to make an opening statement. First up is Dr. Hinterberger. You have 60 seconds.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Right. Ballot Measure 2 is not about bringing marijuana to Alaska. Marijuana is already here, it's widely available, and it's widely used, and it's sold in an underground market by criminals who have an interest and are happy to introduce their customers to harder, more dangerous drugs. Ballot Measure 2 will change that. Ballot Measure 2 will put marijuana production and sales into the hands of regulated, tax-paying, law-abiding business people selling a quality-controlled, regulated product. It will generate tax revenues for the state, it will eliminate the underground market, and most importantly, it will stop making criminals out of thousands of responsible adult marijuana users in this state.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Doctor. Let's head to the other side of the table. Christina, take it away. 60
Thanks for
seconds.
the opportunity. Well, the Yes side is funded by outside interests who have spent nearly $1 million. They're supporting an industry that's predicated on the sales of a harmful drug that would be damaging to our kids and our communities. And we know that Colorado commercialized marijuana about 8 months ago, and they've already seen a lot of problems. Things like increased crime, explosions with folks trying to make marijuana concentrates like butane hash oil. They also have a lot of unintended consequences, things like increased homelessness, increased impaired driving. Alaska doesn't need to be an experiment. We can wait and see what's happening in Colorado, and we don't need to rush to make a decision that would take years to reverse. We're going to hear a lot about alcohol, but public safety officials and former Alaska prosecutors have said that you cannot regulate marijuana like alcohol. So when we consider our communities, our families, and Alaska's future, we need to think about the negative impacts this initiative will have. As Alaskans learn more are opposing it. So we just encourage Alaskans to learn the facts. And when they do, we are confident they will vote no on 2.
Perfect.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Christina. Now we'll get our conversation started with a question for the Yes side. You're pushing to make a major change to state laws and throwing a lot of money in advertising that Alaskans have seen over TV and radio. Most of that money comes from outside of the state. What do you make of the argument that Alaska is just a pawn in the national game to get marijuana legalized throughout the country?
As an Alaskan, lived here for over 30 years, I don't see it as a pawn. I see it as an opportunity to communicate and to advance an informed regulatory policy that will bring marijuana out of the black market and will give us an opportunity to speak openly and objectively with our youth and be honest in our public policy and our health policy.
This side? Do you want to respond to that?
Sure. Well, when we look at the No on 2 side, we're entirely funded by Alaskans who are concerned about this ballot measure, who would like to have a conversation about this with Alaskans. We are absolutely a pawn in this national strategy of the Marijuana Policy Project, and they have said, their executive director has said they don't care about Alaska. But while most people would agree that with that they cannot afford to lose a ballot measure after Colorado and Washington, lest reporters and the public think that this movement is backsliding. So we do feel that the tremendous outside interests reflect in the way that the ballot measure is written that does not accommodate for Alaska's unique communities, for a unique population, and for some of the challenges that we have. Particularly with substance abuse, we think that this is not really about Alaska.
Speaking of unique communities, Alaska has a lot of rural communities outside that aren't as big as Anchorage and Fairbanks and Juneau. How do you think, let's start with this side this time, how do you think that it would affect and impact rural Alaska? You're from Bristol Bay. Mm-hmm. How do you think Bristol Bay would, how would it impact Bristol Bay?
Well, we do know that, for one, Bristol Bay has opposed this by adopting a formal resolution, and many communities have, and over 30 organizations across the state. there is substantial substance abuse in Alaska, and disproportionately so our rural communities. And I saw that growing up. And the fact that our rural communities would not be able to prohibit the transport of this product into their communities, they also would not be able to prohibit the production of this in their communities, speaks to the fact that Alaska rural communities would not have the options that they currently do with alcohol. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, John.
I think you said it eloquently.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Let's
thanks.
head to the other side of the table, because I know that you've dealt with substance abuse. What do you think about legal marijuana in rural communities? Can they handle it?
I think it's there. I think that this is not an opportunity to legalize, it's an opportunity to regulate. And I think by having those opportunities to regulate, we can enhance the access where, in an appropriate way.
I'm afraid that what Christina said about allowing production of marijuana in anywhere in the state is simply untrue. Communities of any nature can opt out just like they can with alcohol. There's a local option in the initiative, a local option measure, to allow communities to prohibit the production and sale of products under this ballot measure. So it really allows the local people to regulate it as they see fit.
All right, well, this is just the start of the debate. When we come back, we'll focus on business and the economic impact of legalizing recreational use of marijuana. Stay with us. Welcome back. We've made some changes to the panel, and we're now going to focus on the business and the economy. Tim Hinderberger is still with us on the vote yes side of the table, but he's now joined by Bruce Schulte with the Coalition for Responsible Cannabis Legislation and Conservatives for Ballot Measure 2. And across from them on this side of the table again is Christina Woolston and a new panel addition, Rachel Petro. Thanks again for joining us, guys. Ms. Petro is the president and CEO of the Alaska Chamber of Commerce. Before that, she served as deputy commissioner for the Alaska Department of Administration. She's lived in Juneau, Ketchikan, and right here in Anchorage. So based on what we've seen in Colorado and Washington, guys, we're going to start with the question, what is the upside for businesses in Alaska if this is passed? We're going to start with the vote yes side over here.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at the industry, the marijuana industry in Alaska right now is an underground industry, $80 to $100 million. If you take this industry legitimate, there's going to be suppliers of equipment and manufacturing equipment, real estate. There's going to be jobs. Not necessarily jobs created, but jobs transferred into the legitimate market.
All right, over here. Sorry, you look very excited to jump in.
As written, there's really no upside for Alaskans or Alaska businesses. Basically, right now, under the ballot measure as proposed, workforce safety should be a primary concern for all Alaskans, and we can't ensure that because there's no testing in place like there is for alcohol. And so until we get those standards in place, it's irresponsible, and it would be a danger for our workforce. And it's just not worth any risk to that. So let's get the standards in place. Let's let Colorado and Colorado and Washington figure it out, dial it in, and then let's, as Alaskans, write and draft a piece of legislation that works for Alaska and Alaska business.
If I may expand on that, Emily, I happen to be in a safety-related industry, and I am on a drug program. And so as a responsible adult, I choose not to consume marijuana because I take that very seriously. By some estimates, roughly 15 to 18% of the population is currently consuming marijuana. Those people are using it responsibly or irresponsibly right now. So the impact on the workforce, I would contend, exists right now. Some industries are on drug programs, some are not. Folks, I think that adults have the option of choosing whether to be a consumer of marijuana or work in a safety-related industry, be on a drug program, and be a responsible adult. It works for me. It works for all my peers. I think that responsible adults can make that decision.
Alaska businesses want to hire Alaskans, and many of the businesses in Alaska are mandated by federal law and many of the jobs available to Alaskans, you just can't. You have to be drug-free, but we want to hire more Alaskans. So in order to facilitate that, let's make sure that whatever we put in place, there's provisions so that we know when folks are impaired and when they're not, because it's not quite as clear-cut. The science isn't there yet, or at least the regs haven't followed it. Let's dial that in before we jump into the game. I mean, it makes sense to just
Well, I think those-
be forward thinking, and for Alaskans to set out a law that makes sense rather than outside entities.
Those regulations and testing measures are already in place. Remember, nothing in this initiative changes the ability of employers to mandate a drug-free workplace. Nothing. It says that specifically in the initiative.
Part of our industry, though, does rely on a safe and ready workforce. And what we've seen in Colorado, there's a study done by the Quest Group that showed that there's been a 20% increase in workforce that has tested positive for marijuana since legalization and commercialization in January. So I think that we just need to consider and look at the full facts. And part of it is just waiting to see the continued lessons out of Colorado.
People who use it responsibly may test positive for inactive marijuana metabolites, but that does not make them unsafe employees.
We're going to stick with the business angle here. We want to know what the impact of taxing pot will have on state coffers. We'll start on this side.
Sure. Well, the state has said that there are going to be a certain amount of cost, and it does not include the cost of creating an entire infrastructure to test, to monitor the production and potency. So we don't even know what those costs would be. But we do know that the state has said it would cost them up to $7 million to try to get their hands around a new industry. The law enforcement side, the Alaska Association of Chiefs of Police, have said it will cost them roughly $6 million to train. And because there is no field sobriety test, the costs are yet unknown, but we do know a lot of that burden would fall in our rural communities, which do not have the resources to, one, either provide the law enforcement or the cost to that. So I think there's also a great lesson learned from Colorado. They've had very disappointing tax revenues. Voters were told that they could see up to $100 million in tax revenue there, and they've seen about 12 so far this year. So I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from Colorado.
If you look at current consumption around the state, if we assume that 100,000 people are consuming marijuana at an average of 2 ounces per year, 200,000 ounces taxed at $50 per, that's about $10 million in revenue. On top of that, if in a legitimate industry, if you add permit fees and so forth, one could argue that the income side would be $10 to $15 million, which I would argue would offset the administrative costs associated with this. On the other side, though, if you're going to have a discussion about the costs, I think you have to look at the cost savings, where we don't have law enforcement investigating people and trying people and bringing them to the courts for minor marijuana offenses. There is a real cost there. I hear varying numbers, but you can't just dismiss that, because there is a real cost there to the law enforcement community.
I would like to just add.
Numbers about Colorado were way off. The projection was about $30 million per year, and they are on track to achieve that, close to it.
I believe those are adjusted revenue since they've seen the
That's
data.
The bottom line is, from a commerce perspective, the Ballot Measure 3 as drafted, and we have no opportunity as Alaskans to tweak it. We can testify all we want at these hearings. I'm sorry, Ballot Measure 2. Thank you. But we don't have an opportunity to tweak it. And the problem is the personal cultivation provision, just like Colorado, it exacerbates the black market. And so that's part of the revenue issue in Colorado. So again, let's be measured about this as Alaskans. Let's figure this out. Let's draft it as a group of Alaskans so that it works for us, rather than having an outside interest. Let's just do it right here in Alaska.
Drafting regulations is part of the plan. It's right in the initiative. There's a 9-month rulemaking process.
But regulations are very tough to promulgate. It takes a lot of time. 9 months
9 months is plenty of time.
Short.
Based on the evidence of what we're seeing that's working well in Washington State. People keep talking about Colorado. The situation in Colorado is quite different from Washington and from what will happen here. Colorado had a pretty lenient medical marijuana industry before the so-called recreational market appeared. And that has created all these problems about, more than 2/3 of the dispensaries in Colorado are medical dispensaries that have a different licensing, a different taxing, different advertising rules. Those are things that we won't have to deal with here in Alaska when we build our system from scratch.
Let's talk about that real quick.
Great.
Because speaking of taxes, in Colorado, medical dispensaries are taxed differently than stores are. And then there's the black market, which has no taxes. So there is some evidence in Colorado that the black market has actually expanded because people don't want to pay the taxes. How do we handle that here in Alaska? We'll start over here.
Again, that's not going to be the same situation here in Alaska. There is not the same kind of medical production industry as there was in Colorado that drove the price down and discouraged people from buying through the legitimate stores once they opened.
I would offer that under a completely unregulated black market industry, there is no testing of the product. People don't know what they're buying. They don't know the potency. They don't know if it's been adulterated with pesticides or residual fertilizers. In a regulated environment, all of those things can be addressed. And the rulemaking provisions in Ballot Measure 2 allow for that. They allow for quality control. They allow for testing, packaging, marketing restrictions. Most of those arguments that are put forth against Ballot Measure 2 are addressed in the rulemaking portion of Ballot Measure 2.
I would completely disagree with that. This is a voter initiative. This is legislation, and so you can only regulate up to what the legislation says. And the legislation protects edibles. It protects things like marijuana concentrates. It protects all definition of marijuana included. Now, what we know is that this ballot measure is virtually the same language as Colorado. And we also know that they're having a lot of problems, and they're trying to change their laws already. And we would not be able to do that for 2 years because of our state's constitution's rules around ballot measures. And in Washington, they had 2 years to come up with their regulations, and they had a ballot measure that was over 50 pages long. Ours is 8 pages long. There are a lot of holes. We need to let Colorado go forward because that is the most comparative opportunity that we have for the commercialization, industrialization of marijuana in another state.
Emily, first of all, Colorado was starting with a clean slate, and we are not. Second of all, there are specific provisions in the ballot measure that allow for the legislature, through their designated board, to put restrictions and guidelines on packaging, labeling, potency, and so forth. The Coalition for Responsible Cannabis Legislation exists for exactly that purpose. The goal of that group after November 4th is to work with the legislature to come up with sensible guidelines that address all the concerns of folks on both sides. Nobody wants kids to have access to edible cannabis products. That's just ridiculous. Everybody wants a safe, regulated, legitimate environment.
Again, what's the rush? So if you look at the timeline of when our legislature meets, the timeline provided in the ballot measure, they don't mesh. So you have 9 months till we need to go to get all the regulations set. We've got one legislative session coming up here in 4 months. They meet for 90 days. Are we talking special session? It takes a while to ramp up. Again, what's the rush? Let's do this through a deliberative process, having Alaska conversation rather than people testifying and not influencing the actual what voters are going to vote on. Let's let our 60 elected officials, let's have a conversation about what will Alaska look like? How will we commercialize marijuana?
That's what's going to happen after this passes.
Right. So you're gonna pass it first and then decide how to regulate it.
That's how regulations are done. You pass,
that
you
is
pass
how
the
regulations
enabling
are done,
legislation
but not
first,
how
and
laws
then
So much to talk about. We're going to have to stop this segment, having a lively discussion here, and we're only halfway done. It continues next, and we talk about crime and whether legalizing pot will help or harm Alaska public safety. We'll be joined by Anchorage Police Chief Mark Mew and criminal defense attorney Rex Butler. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our next part of the conversation where we deal with crime. Does legalizing marijuana help or hurt our state's law enforcement efforts? Joining us are Anchorage Police Chief Mark Mew, who's representing the Alaska Association of Chiefs of Police as well as the Muni of Anchorage. Chief Mew has worked his way up the ranks of APD, starting as a patrol officer 15 years ago. In that time, he's worked with the Anchorage School District and with the SWAT team. He lives in Anchorage with his wife and has raised 2 kids here. With him is Deborah Williams. She is a former chair of the Alaska Democratic Party. She's a mother, grandmother, and a longtime Alaska public health advocate. Let's go to this side of the table where we're joined by attorney Rex Butler. Mr. Butler has been practicing law, mostly criminal defense, since moving to Alaska in 1983 and opened up his own firm 2 years later. He's worked on a number of cases that involved marijuana. He and his wife have 4 children, all of them East High graduates. And the next panelist is Bill Parker, co-chair for the Vote Yes campaign and former deputy commissioner of the Alaska Department of Corrections. All right, guys, we're going to start with kind of a general question. What would the impact be to Alaska's criminal justice system? We're going to start with the Vote No side over here. Go ahead, guys.
Well, I'll start out first by saying that you made me feel quite young, because You knocked 10 years off my sentence here at the city. I started the same time Rex did in 1983.
Oh
so.
boy, okay.
Well, we have a lot of questions about what's going to happen here, and we're looking at, Washington and Colorado. Some of our biggest concerns are how we're going to make drunk driving cases with marijuana involved in them. We're having some of those already, naturally. We anticipate we'll have many more. We don't have a per se limit in the state for marijuana. I mean, you know that 0.08 is the level for driving under the influence of alcohol. We don't have a certain number of nanograms yet that would help us make a straightforward case on marijuana. That's maybe a separate issue. The legislature could deal with that, even without legalizing marijuana, but it'll become more of an issue if we don't have that in place. It puts us in a position of having to investigate based on the circumstances and trying to make driving behavior related to the presence of a compound that doesn't have a limit on it. Those blood tests are going to be involved. That's expensive. You have to store it. You have to analyze it. It's not the quick and dirty OUI case that we're used to doing with alcohol. That's going to challenge us. It's going to mean we're going to have to train our people better with more advanced training, DRE training, a RIDE training, which is an acronym for roadside something or other. But we estimate it's going to take a lot of money. The statewide, I think ACOP is saying about $3 million to get law enforcement up to the place where we can make these kinds of cases.
Over here.
Well, I respectfully disagree with the chief. As it stands now, having defended these cases, if APD stops someone that they believe is impaired as a driver, and the person blows in the data master and they blow 000, which means there's no alcohol in their system, then police officers get a warrant, draw the blood, and the blood is tested. I agree with the chief in the sense that the legislature could fix at least the amount of nanograms of cocaine that of the active ingredient of THC that has to be present in one's blood to determine a limit for the purposes of OUI, which I think out of Washington now is 5 nanograms. And so that part can be fixed, as the chief said, whether or not this passes. And so the routine that APD is using now works. And so I don't know that it would really have that much of an impact, because if they smell marijuana, you blow 000, they're going to get blood work on you.
Talk about, you're a defense lawyer. Talk about some of the people that you see that come to you with charges involving marijuana, and if we legalize marijuana, would a lot of that burden on the justice system go away?
Well, I think that it would, because what happens now is if, APD officers or even troopers around the state stop a vehicle, if they smell marijuana, then of course that stop turns into a criminal investigation immediately. If you allow them to search your car, which you don't have to, but if you allow that to happen, they'll search it. If they don't find anything, sometimes they'll let you go. Sometimes they impound the vehicle. You either have to walk or you get arrested for whatever the case may be. When you have those kinds of situations, there's an impact on the criminal justice system. If you have marijuana in your pocket while you're walking down the street and law enforcement officers find out about it, then of course they cite you. It's a criminal case. You have to go to court on it. We're allowed to have a certain amount in our homes, but the real question is, how do you get it there? If you get it there, once you're outside with it, then it's a crime. It's citable, it's prosecutable, and it's probably largely a waste of resources.
Let's talk about kids and marijuana, because this law, 21 and older, you would be allowed to smoke marijuana. Talk about children, and would you think that this would encourage them to smoke marijuana?
We know many things from looking at Colorado. One is that since marijuana became more available in Colorado, the number of youth using marijuana has increased. We also know that this legislation proposes to legalize child-attractive marijuana products like edibles, and also very serious marijuana concentrate products like shatter, butane, hash oil, and so forth. We know unquestionably that marijuana has adverse impacts on the developing adolescent brain. We also know that you cannot regulate marijuana like alcohol. You just can't. And if you try, you could face dramatic increases in the amount of marijuana that youth use. For 12th graders in Alaska, twice as many 12th graders consume alcohol than marijuana. Marijuana would be commercialized, advertised, and industrialized under this initiative. There would be pervasive advertising, and there would be products that would be child attractive. This is bad legislation for our youth and our communities.
Let's toss it over here. Bill Parker, do you think that high people are more likely to commit crimes, someone that has smoked marijuana versus someone that has done coke or other sort of drugs?
The chief's probably the expert on the numbers, but I'd say 90% of the people in prison in Alaska were high on alcohol at the time of the crime. So our country tried prohibiting alcohol for 13 years, from 1920 to 1933. It was called a noble experiment. It clearly failed. And now the new prohibition of marijuana in Alaska is clearly failing. Over 100,000 people use it. There's a huge underground network, the black market, that sells it. And acting like this vote is about whether or not we should let it across the state border is misleading. The question is, now that there's all this money and effort and law enforcement involved in marijuana, are we making any sense? Are we getting a hold of this, or is it time to regulate it like alcohol?
Chief Mew, go ahead. I know you guys are kind of short on officers right now. Do you think that this would be kind of another task that would put a strain on the police department?
Well, certainly we see more work that would be coming our way. And I don't know at this point whether we'd be investigating right now we investigate whether or not it's marijuana. In the future, we may be investigating whether or not it's legal marijuana or legal marijuana and did the taxes get paid and all that. So, I mean, I have a lot of questions about that. But in the meantime, I think something that we heard here is that about people who are charged with marijuana. I think people have the impression that there's a lot of folks in prison that are in there because of marijuana, and that's just not the case. As Mr. Butler said, you get a citation 99% of the time. You do go to court, yeah, we get that, but we're not locking people up for merely marijuana. That's not the case. If there's probably only a dozen people in our prisons right now that are in there for only marijuana, and that may be tag along with an armed robbery charge or something else, but if you're just caught with pot right now, you're just getting a citation, if that. So, you know, I wanted to put that to rest if I could.
If I could just add, you know, when it comes down to crime and marijuana, you know, as Bill said, most of the crime is fueled by alcohol, not by marijuana. Marijuana smokers don't seem to be the basis for a lot of crime. And let's not be naive. Marijuana is here. There's lots of it here, and there are lots of users here. The real question is, should the government regulate it, tax it, and get the revenues from it like it does with cigarette smoking, which is more harmful than anything else we can probably find, and alcohol, which of course is very harmful, but city, state, and federal government gets lots of tax money off of both of them. And so maybe it's time now to realistically look at marijuana that's everywhere. It's throughout the state, from barrel to Ketchikan and beyond. So let's just not be naive about it.
If I may.
We have about 20 seconds.
It's very important, though. There is no evidence whatsoever in Colorado, Washington, or anywhere in the world that when you legalize marijuana, that alcohol consumption goes down. In fact, in Colorado, alcohol revenues have gone up. This is an additive, mind-altering substance, not one that reduces alcohol consumption. And it's also very important to point out that this legislation provides all kinds of public health problems and public safety problems, including butane hash oil. This legislation specifically legalizes the processing of marijuana using butane hash oil and other processing in a person's home if they grow marijuana. Butane hash oils have expanded tremendously. This has so many public health and public safety problems.
Thank you, Deborah. We're going to have to unfortunately toss it to break. I would like to thank everyone involved with this section of the show. Up next, we'll talk about whether using marijuana is safe or dangerous. Stick with us. Welcome back. We've been talking about legalizing marijuana and whether it will bring dollars into state coffers or cost more to administer. And what about crime? How does legalizing pot impact public safety? But underlying all this talk about voting yes or no to make pot legally available to Alaskan adults is health. Should we vote for something that will help us or hurt us? For this part of the conversation, we've changed up our panel. Joining us once again is Dr. Kelly Drew and Dr. Tim Hinterberger. Over on this side of the table against the measure, we're joined by Jeff Jesse. Mr. Jesse has worked in the mental health field for 30 years, and he is both the CEO of the Alaska Mental Health Trust and is attorney representing people with disabilities. He is also a father of two. And returning to the panel is former chair of the Alaska Democratic Party and health advocate Deborah Williams. All right, we're going to start with a pretty general question. Is marijuana safe? And we're going to start on this side of the table this time.
Marijuana is one of the safest substances that's widely used by humans. There is no single recorded case of somebody overdosing from marijuana. It's very safe in the hands of responsible adult users. I'm sure our opposition will be citing spurious statistics to the opposite, and we're prepared to address those if we have time here.
I could speak to that as well as somebody trained in pharmacology. I've published papers in addiction, brain injury, and I teach a class where we talk about the cannabinoids. And in terms of addiction, dependence, and risk for abuse, it's very, very low relative to drugs already accepted. In my professional opinion, the legal consequences and risk of legal consequences to adults as well as youth far outweigh the medical consequences and risks of being exposed or using the drug.
All right, over here.
Emily, probably the most misleading premise advanced by the pro-commercialization folks is that because they believe marijuana is safer than alcohol, it's safe. In fact, they believe it's so safe that Alaskans should allow the creation of an industry dedicated to promoting the increased use of marijuana so that they can profit from that increased use. In fact, marijuana is not safe, and it's certainly not safe enough to warrant the creation of this type of a promotional industry. The New England Journal of Medicine has documented the addiction rate of 9% for people that smoke marijuana. If an adolescent starts smoking marijuana when they're a teenager, that rate goes up to 15%. There are increased rates of motor vehicle accidents, various other health consequences. Marijuana is not safe. We certainly don't need an industry to promote its increased use.
It's very important to point out, too, what this particular initiative attempts to legalize, commercialize, and advertise. It is important for Alaskans to read the definition of marijuana. It is extreme. It includes not only marijuana that some people know, but it includes concentrates such as shatter, butane hash oil, and earwax, and it of course incorporates edibles. We know from Colorado how many young people are going to the hospital because of ingesting edibles. We know of 2 deaths associated with marijuana and concentrates. And so what we are finding from Colorado, which is why we need to wait to see what happens in Colorado, is that marijuana, especially as defined by this initiative to include edibles and concentrates, is not safe.
All right, back over here, you guys talked about how marijuana is safe. How about addicting? Is marijuana addictive?
So there's 2 aspects to addiction. One is drug-seeking behavior. Drug-seeking behavior is a learned behavior. It's a behavior that can be learned for anything. You can be addicted to chocolate. Something that's easier to get your head around is dependence. And the withdrawal syndrome from marijuana has been described in very heavy users that is probably less than what you experience with withdrawal from caffeine. So people who drink a lot of coffee will have a headache and some discomfort if the coffee is not available. Same with somebody that uses very, very large amounts of marijuana. There may be some irritability. but these is from people consuming large quantities, more than the typical responsible user. And so from the dependence perspective, marijuana has very, very little physical dependence.
Back over here.
Use of marijuana and the degree to which people use it is basically based on two things: availability and social acceptability, particularly with adolescents. When you get into a situation where, unlike alcohol, you have a major marketing of edibles, where there is yet another available way to ingest this substance, you're just increasing the availability. Now this is going to be in people's homes. Once it comes out of that packaging, it's totally indistinguishable from any other edible. Social acceptability is another big issue, particularly for adolescents. I've heard the pro-commercialization folks say, kids say it's easier to get marijuana than it is alcohol, but they don't smoke marijuana at the rate they consume alcohol. We believe a lot of that's because the advertising for alcohol makes that seem a normalized activity. The commercialization and the promotion of marijuana, we believe, will have the same impact and will increase the use of marijuana among this very vulnerable group.
I want to bring up kids because as a new mom, if this passes, I'm concerned about my child. So both sides talk about kids and marijuana use. You said it's safe, but is it safe for children?
I think the whole point is that it will be regulated, and I think that kids have access to marijuana now. And by being able to regulate it, we can take it away from access to kids. More importantly, kids get access to marijuana through the black market. And so not only are they introduced to marijuana, they're introduced to the black market. And the black market is where they can find cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and not to mention in terms of acceptability, they accept the black market. The black market is something that is okay. And as a matter of fact, in the misinformation they get from the scare tactics against marijuana, they learn to mistrust the information. And this is a very, very bad way to inform our children. And so I think that the opportunity to legitimize and regulate the marijuana industry is ultimately going to be good for public health and better for our children.
Could not agree less with everything you just said, including, first of all, we know from Colorado that the black market is thriving, has increased. Under any circumstances, there will be a black market for youth under 21. This does not impact the black market for youth under 21 because it is still illegal. What this does, as Mr. Jeffy said, is that it increases the advertising, the promotion, the availability, not only of regular marijuana, but marijuana lollipops, marijuana candy corn, marijuana gummy bears, very attractive to youth. And it increases the availability, the advertising, and the commercialization of marijuana concentrates. This piece of legislation unquestionably is bad for our youth, and we are seeing that in Colorado. There's every reason to come to the conclusion that you cannot regulate this, particularly with respect to youth, because even this makes it illegal, but this will increase the attractiveness, the availability, and the underground market of marijuana for youth.
I believe that it is all about regulation, and the way the initiative is written, there is opportunity for a marijuana control board that can regulate the concentration that's available, the way it's packaged, how it is advertised. All these things that have become concern in Colorado can be avoided through appropriate regulation. Exactly. That it is not regulated now.
I don't know why our opposition is so dismissive of regulation. Regulation works. Regulation works differently in Washington State than it does in Colorado for reasons that I explained earlier. If we don't want child-friendly edibles on the market in Alaska, there will not be child-friendly edibles on the market in Alaska. And to say otherwise is simply misrepresenting this initiative and the rulemaking process.
Really quickly, we have 90 seconds. Let's talk about alcohol, because you guys have said marijuana is safer than alcohol. What do you guys say?
Well, one thing that I heard is that somehow by regulating marijuana, we're going to keep marijuana out of the hands of adolescents because it's going to be regulated. Well, that certainly hasn't worked for alcohol. We try to tightly regulate alcohol, and it's available to kids. And you can't go to any town in Alaska and not any neighborhood in Anchorage on any Friday or Saturday night and not find a multitude of underage drinking parties. That's because the industry has normalized the consumption of alcohol, and the creation of a marijuana industry will do the same thing. If they really wanted to just focus on medical marijuana or decriminalizing very small quantities, that would be a different discussion. But that's not what this initiative is about. This initiative is about generating revenue and profits for an industry dedicated to promoting the increased use of marijuana.
What I said is that we'll keep the kids out of the black market. I think that's what's
But it's
really
not
the
going
most
to keep them
important.
out of the black market because that's the only place they can buy it if they're an adolescent. They're not going to be able to go to the corner store and buy marijuana
just like with
you and I.
prohibition of alcohol, there was a transition period where supply and demand, the prohibitionist or the black market, they continued, they persisted.
You think that we're keeping alcohol out of the hands of adolescents today because it's regulated?
But you keep the kids out of the black market.
The black market for other every sale to kids is a black market sale. Every sale to someone
there will not be a black market once the legitimate regulated market supplies the demand.
That's
and
ridiculous.
Once
The black market will always be able to undercut the price of regulated marijuana.
Obviously, this is a spirited debate. We're out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much for being with us. I'd like to thank all of our guests for taking the time to be here and everyone at home for watching. Election Day is November 4th, and it's up to you to help decide the future of our great state. Be sure to look for this and the rest of our Show Me the Money series on KTVA.com and on GCI Cable on demand. I'm Emily Carlson. Thanks for watching.